So, here we are again. What is the default position? Atheism or theism? Yeah, it's a fun one. We're back here. Why? Well, Matt Dillahunty sort of prompted it with his... If you've been paying attention to Dillahunty, he, over the last week, he tweeted out possibly the most ignorant tweets I've ever seen him tweet out. So much so that Steve McRae did a whole 2-hour series on just his tweets. Really pretty good video. You should check it out. But the gist of it is, when you ask the question, what is the default position? Some atheist inevitably says the null hypothesis is, and there's some weird colloquial definition of the null hypothesis, which basically has nothing to do with what the null hypothesis actually is. It's some jujitsu colloquial definition that means, as best as I can piece together, it's a play off the word null and hypothesis, and it sort of vaguely seems to mean, well, since there's no good evidence for theism, the null hypothesis, your starting point is, I don't believe in God or God does not exist. Something like that. That's kind of what Matt Dillahunty said. He said the null hypothesis is God does not exist. And then he went on to subtweet to basically argue that there's no such category as agnosticism. As weird as that sounds. He said God, God, you can only take one of two positions. God either exists or does not exist. And the second tweet was, it actually was that. The second tweet was a conflation of ontology with belief, which atheists do a lot. Ontologically, he's correct. God either exists or does not exist. But as far as agnosticism goes, there are three possible positions towards the proposition God exists. Okay, you either believe it, theist, you don't believe it, atheist, or you are, in the middle, unconvinced, on the fence. In that category, you could easily put don't care, not concerned with it, not interested in solving the question. That's agnostic on the topic. Now, I don't know why he doesn't know that. Steve seemed to think he was lying. I struck me as really profoundly ignorant. I mean, that's a really basic, that there are three positions. Back when I was in the day, I never called myself an atheist. I called myself an agnostic, partially because I was indifferent. Asked me if God exists. I had different priorities. I didn't really care. I was like, that's not my priority. I don't care if God exists. If he exists, show himself. That was kind of my attitude. If you pressed me, I guess I probably would have said I leaned towards no, which would have made me kind of an atheist. But I was mostly an agnostic. I had my priorities. Said my priorities were girls and alcohol. Said, hey, Craig, you coming over tonight? I said, I don't know. Is there going to be girls there? Is there going to be alcohol there? No. Well, then, no, probably not. Probably won't be there. Thanks for inviting me. No, I don't think I will be. But the null hypothesis, okay, the actual null hypothesis, there's, like I said, there's some weird mental, pretzel logic, colloquial definition of the null hypothesis that emerged out of atheist land and floats around that seems to mean sort of a play off the word null, that all things being equal, you start out from the point of view that God does not exist. I guess that's what it means. But what the null hypothesis actually is relevant only to statistics as far as I know. So I'm not even sure if it can be used for a proposition like God exists. But it's comparing a set against the mean. So you say let's say you were at a blackjack table and say, I'm making a lot of money at blackjack. The null hypothesis would be the thing you compare it to. No statistical variance whatsoever. That's what the null hypothesis actually means. And as far as I know, it's only related to statistics. This weird colloquial definition that has popped up, it's pseudoscientific at best, and it's bizarre. I've never heard anybody explain it coherently because there's really no coherence behind it. What the null hypothesis has to do with statistics, okay? It's what you are basing your no statistical variation versus I'm making money on this blackjack table, and then you compare it to the null hypothesis. I didn't explain that all that well, but it's not really that important. I'm pretty sure you know exactly what I mean. If you want more on the topic, I watched Answers from Reason does a really good analysis of it, where I'm pretty sure it's a short enough video that you'll get the point. I watched it a long time ago. And then recently, a couple people have taken up this cross because of this tweet. So it's not really that important. The question is the default position. What is the default position, theism or atheism? Now, that's kind of just a fun topic. It's not really all that important, but there's a problem for the people who keep arguing that atheism is somehow the default position. First of all, it all depends on who's right. Now, my wife would argue, okay, our cat, for example, doesn't necessarily have God beliefs at all, correct? It's an animal. But, right, therefore she's an atheist, Craig. She doesn't believe in God. Yeah, okay. But my wife insists, it's possible that when we play worship music, the cat, it feels the presence of God and feels the peace of God, so joins us. And when we put on worship music, the cat comes in the room with us and, blisses out to our worship music and feels the peace of God. Now, that's possible if there is a God, and that would also be possible. I'm sure there are thousands of Christian parents who have young children who, when their kid starts crying, they put on worship music, go, see, the peace of God has settled them down. So if there is a God, it's entirely possible that people could be having that experience precognition, without cognizing, the deity. It's possible, if there is a presence there to be experienced, that people could experience that presence without having any sort of conceptual framework to tie it into. That's possible. That's generally not what people mean by the default position. But here's the problem for the atheists who argue that is a default position. Okay, keep in mind, even in today's world where atheism is somewhat common, it's still relatively rare, all things considered. Theism is a lot more common than atheism, a lot more common. Now, if you go all the way back to time immemorial, the beginning of time, okay, you would have had places in the world, for example, in Africa, where there was no such thing as an atheist at all. Nobody was an atheist, not a single solitary human being. How could you convincingly argue that is the default position if there were times in history where nobody held it? It's inconceivable to some degree. So if you want to do an honest analysis of it, you have to ask yourself a question, even as an atheist. Granted, people could be perceiving something that isn't there, but you have to ask yourself a question. If atheism is true, why so many theists? Why are there so many theists? Why is theism more common than atheism? And I think the answer is really pretty obvious. Agency detection is as common as grass. That's something I've said in other videos, and that holds true today. It is so common, in fact, that even people who are atheists still experience it. The difference is they disconnect the mechanism on purpose. But they still experience. I've heard them talk on Twitter. I've heard actual atheists say, my Christian brainwashing, obviously they don't ascribe it to a deity, but they will still experience agency detection, and they'll go, my Christian brainwashing is so complete that I woke up this morning with this thought that God put it on my heart to do X. Now, obviously the atheist doesn't think God put it on their heart, but the thing just appearing inside of you, prompting you to go do something or go do this, that happens to everybody. That's the agency detection. There's even a theory of atheism that says, like, the reason why religion exists is because overactive agency detection. That's actual what they think prompts religion. But the point is, you go all the way back to the beginning of time, and people were having those agents. If you are an atheist, obviously you don't think that's a deity. You would probably ascribe that to your subconscious mind. Fair enough. Could easily just be your subconscious mind talking. But that's where theist ideas come from. And there are also spiritual experiences. Now, to use Matt Dillahunty as an example, he has argued in debates, in actual formal debates, I've heard this argue a few times, that the reason why we can know science is true and religion is false is that if you stripped away society and started over on a desert island with 100 or so people, religion would disappear altogether and science would reassert itself and be reborn in almost the exact same form as it is now. Now, that is not true. That is absolutely 100% not true. If you put everyone on a desert island and started over, even if those people were all atheists, religion would reassert itself within 100 years, most likely as polytheism. Why? What would happen? 20% of the people on the island, even if they were committed atheists, would have what we call a spiritual experience or a numinous experience. They'd go off into a forest somewhere, and they'd have a type of experience that, atheists will argue are wildly divergent and they're all contradictory, and they're not. They're so similar, in fact, that there's a diagnostic criteria for them, and they transcend cultures. So 20% of the people on that island would go have a spiritual experience. The only variation is when you come back and you try to interpret the experience, that would have something to do with the person who had the experience and how they interpret it. The interpretive frameworks are all over the place and culturally specific, but the experiences themselves are not they're very common and they transcend cultures. They're called spiritual experience, self-transcending experiences, and there's a diagnostic criteria for them. There's roughly 8 to 10 different things that have to appear in order for them to be considered the spiritual experience. Ineffable, time dilation or time distortion. You start feeling like either time moves really fast or really slow. Some sense of profound unity of connection to either a being or all of being. Generally a sense of peace. My sister had one of these before we became Christian. I've talked about this in other videos. Before we became Christians, she was sitting on the beach looking at her son, and she had some experience that she just felt this oneness and this sense of peace and order and like this profound sense of like, yes, I'm in the right place, doing the right thing. It was some sort of connection to her child that prompted it. Now those happen all the time, and they transcend cultures and they transcend ideologies and they transcend different religions. And as I said, it's when, if you're in India and you go off in the forest and have an experience like that, you're going to tie it in to your specific religion. So you come back and you say, Shiva was really speaking to me out in that forest. If you're in Arkansas and you go off in the woods and have some sort of mystical or spiritual experience, you're going to go, wow, Jesus was really talking to me that night. I got to get right with God. And if you're in, Islam, if you're in Afghanistan and you go, Allah was really trying to speak to me. It's the cultural specifics are different and sometimes contradictory, but the experience itself is not contradictory. It is of a kind, is so close are they and so parallel that there's literally a diagnostic criteria for them. A set of things that all need to be ducks all in a row for you to go, yes, that was legitimately a self-transcendent spiritual experience. So that would happen. You put everyone on a desert island, and that would happen within 100 years. Religion would reassert itself most plausibly as polytheism. So perhaps the better question to ask is the better observation is that, what the default isn't really a good question. There is something about theism, polytheism in particular, that seems to be, by direct observation, primal and innate. Primal and innate. Happens to human beings unprompted by religious observances. Right now that they're having a debate on Twitter where Dave Rollins is, taking up the cross and fighting the good fight with Dr. Matthew Hunt again, who seems to think that, there's an infinite regress of religion. That's basically what the gist of the debate is. The only reason that people believe religion is because somebody taught it to them. Okay, but who taught it to them? Going all the way back to what? Back to forever? How it originally prompts into somebody is somebody disconnects from their tribe, their group of origin, goes off and has a numinous experience, a spiritual experience, or a self-transcending experience, and then they come back to the tribe and they try and explain what happened to them. From that experience, all religions are usually born. That's my guess, and that's a really good educated guess. It could not be the origin of religion, but it makes sense to me that would be the most plausible one. And like I said, that happens to roughly 20% of the people in the population any given place. And it has nothing to do with whether they start out as an atheist, Christian, or whatever. Nothing to do with that. There are a lot of Christians who don't have spiritual experiences at all. It's alien to them. And then there are Christians like me, who it's the bread and butter of everything they talk about. Spiritual experiences, not alien to me. Cultivated all the time. It's constant in my life. So there's a wide variety of, even within Christianity, variations on how much of spiritual experiences and how spiritual people are. I think Christianity teaches you that it's absolutely essential. It teaches you pray without ceasing, to cultivate those spiritual experiences and amplify them, and that it's entirely volitional, entirely up to you. So how much you commit to cultivating spiritual experiences is up to you. When an atheist says, I used to be a Christian, I was a real Christian. Yeah, you were a real Christian, but you weren't really a gung-ho warrior type who woke up at 9 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning for a 9 o'clock service and did what a Christian calls be prayed up. It's possible you were, My experience is people like that don't walk away. Why? Because they experience what religion offers. The powerful self-transformational experience that religion is religion's actual claim to fame. That's my experience. People like that don't deconvert. Why? Because they're committed. they're in the fold, and they're really, they're basically busy trying to turn themselves on fire to amplify the fire within, so to speak, to use Christianese. Now, the only thing that I would point out is it's really hard to argue convincingly that atheism is some type of default position. You have to use pretzel logic to do it. Why? Because it's so much less common than theism. It's fairly common now, and what I'm starting to argue in other videos is that has to do with people's metaphysical a priori assumptions. And what I think it most specifically can be tied to is scientism meets materialism. That is the starting point for most of the well-educated people in our culture, even theists. They vaguely ascribe to those metaphysical a priori assumptions about the world. Materialism and some form of scientism. Scientism, as I've explained in other videos, is an offshoot of logical positivism, but it's really prominent. It's really prominent in the scientific community today by really, really big name scientists. Almost everyone you've heard of, just about. Who's the guy? Neil deGrasse Tyson. Almost any name you can name. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a scientismist. It's basically the idea that philosophy is dead. Philosophy is over. There's some sort of weird, sort of mystical pseudo idea that science is all we need, and science is some sort of catch-all definition that explains everything. Dr. Matthew Hunt is a scientismist. Says things like, philosophy is basically belittles philosophy all the time, as if science wasn't completely nested inside of philosophy. That's the point. That's why scientists, I've explained this in other videos, so I won't explain it in this video. But that's why scientism is a false starting point. Why? Because you can't do science without interpretive frameworks, which are the tool of the philosopher. You can't properly think clearly without interpretive frameworks, and that is a tool of the philosopher. Interpretations of quantum mechanics. Science is nested within philosophy. Other than that, it's incoherent. That's why scientism ultimately fails. That's why logical positivism failed. Why? Because it was an incoherent starting point. But it was that line of thinking taken to its most logical conclusion. The only things that have meaning are things that can be empirically verified for. Now, that's the catchphrase of the logical positivist. Does that sound like a lot of atheists? Yeah, as a matter of fact, it does. As I've argued in other videos, logical positivism is really, 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 really influential in the atheist community today. It's where you think the sense-making apparati are located. If you think they are only located in the material realm, which is mistaken, you are basically a logical positivist. The reason why it was basically, had a short shelf life is it's self-refuting just right from there. That's the thesis. That anything that cannot be empirically verified for is meaningless. Any statement that cannot be empirically verified for is meaningless and incoherent. Can you, the obvious rejoinder, can you empirically verify for that statement? No, actually I cannot. Okay, then your philosophy is basically that we're done with philosophy and that's your philosophy. Correct? It's like the liar's paradox as a form of philosophy. It is completely and obviously self-refuting. And that's why when you talk to a lot of atheists on Twitter who are heavily influenced by scientism, including Matt Dillahunty, by the way, they say things that are borderline incoherent. Why? Because they don't really have a thorough grasp of philosophy. It's really hard to have a thorough grasp of philosophy if you belittle the whole project. Dr. Matthew Hunt is a perfect case in point. Guy's easily intelligent enough to understand philosophy. So it's just kind of this weird, I don't do that type of thing that makes him belittle it, downplay it, say, I don't need to think clearly on subjects. Why? Because science is going to solve that all. That's the gist of it. Science is going to solve everything. I don't need to nest anything in clear and coherent concepts, metaphysical priors, any of that mumbo jumbo. That's all mumbo jumbo. Science. Just show me the facts, and I'll tell you the truth. Show me the facts, and I'll tell you the truth, and it ain't quite that simple. Now, getting back to the issue at hand. So I think I've wrapped it all up in a pretty little package. I won't go on for 50 minutes like I normally do. It's really hard to argue convincingly that atheism is some sort of default position. Why? There were times and places in the history of our world wherein there was no atheist to be found anywhere at all. You go back to Africa, circa 3000 BC, and there was no atheist around. So how could you convincingly argue that that's the default position? It can't be. Can't be. You could be right. They could be practicing, like I said, where those theistic ideas most plausibly came from is from spiritual experiences and your subconscious mind, which tends to speak to you as if it's third party. Christians talk about a still small voice. Every atheist listening to me has heard that still small voice. The only thing a Christian is doing is ascribing agency to that voice, that it is something external to me, it is God prompting me. An atheist would argue it is some sort of innate survival mechanism or something like that. But they've still experienced the voice. That's the point. And nobody doesn't heed that voice. You're about to cross the street and something speaks to you and goes, don't do it. You don't do it. Or you don't live to talk about it. That could also be why theism is so much more common than atheism. Why? Because the atheists got killed. Give me evidence not to do it. And they got hit by the car. Give me some evidence that I should heed that still small voice inside me. You don't know what to tell. You don't know how to talk to me. And he goes and gets hit by the car. Why? Because there wasn't enough evidence for him to be convinced by his inner prompting. It's basically the gist of it. Everybody experiences inner prompting, even atheists. Inner promptings. You wake up, something planted inside of you that you didn't plant there, saying, go do this. The Christian resolves that by saying, God just planted in my heart. The atheist resolves that by disconnecting the mechanism that ascribes anything to it. If they look, they'll probably say, oh, it's, my subconscious, or I just had a feeling I should do this. They don't look to resolve it according to some, theology or some outside mechanism. But they still have the experience. That's the point. So it's really hard to convincingly argue that atheism is the default mechanism. If it were, atheism were the default position. If it were, atheism would be 100 times more common than theism. Hello? Isn't that like kind of a no-brainer? It's the default position that most people don't hold to? How does that work exactly? It's default, Craig. Yeah, I understand that. It's the default that most people don't believe. How does that work? Because they were taught to lies by the religious people and they believed them. Like Dave was arguing, those religious ideas had a genesis somewhere. They weren't just taught out of thin air from somebody to somebody. There isn't an infinite regress of religious teaching going all the way back to nowhere. There's an infinite regress of religious teaching going all the way back to a source. And that source is spiritual experiences. And if you took away all of society as it's currently constituted, put everybody on an island, and had to start from scratch, religion would reassert itself within a very short period of time. Most plausibly is polytheism. So I would say the question, is it the default, is probably a misleading question. Probably the better question is it primal and innate? Is theism primal and innate? And I would say really obviously yes, as evidenced by the fact that it's been practiced by more people than not. There you go. It's that simple. We'll see. Someone's going to take issue with this. Even if it goes down that easy. We'll see how it goes. Someone's going to take issue with something. I can feel it in my bones. My Skyfarer is telling me someone's going to not buy it, Craig. Well, too bad. Too bad. Pretty sure it's the truth. So, there you have it, kids. Try to make a shorter video on a fun topic. That is all for now. Mass has ended. Go in peace. Amen.